This is Calvin Hammond in studio for From the Front Line. Tonight in studio we have Dr. Peter Hammond to discuss a very popular and trending topic today and a very popular question. What is wrong with education today? Peter, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, what's wrong with education today? I think most of our education institutions are not educating. They might be schooling, but schooling is not the same thing as education. Education should be teaching people how to think critically, not teaching people what to think. Repeat after me, wrote, politically correct. No, you're not allowed to think that, you're not allowed to say that. No, truth does not fear investigation. So the trouble with education today is most of the so-called education departments of governments are not really involved in education, but indoctrination. And so the schools, instead of being built on the rock of God's word and good investigation and the scientific method, is in all too many cases trying to bring out clones who are in the mold of the politically correct, this is what you've got to think and this is what you've got to believe. You're not allowed to think that, you're not allowed to say that, there's a thought crime. Sort of George Orwell, 1984, thought crimes, thought police business. So what's wrong with education today? Well, most of the education institutions are actually not educating, they're just indoctrinating, I'm sorry to say.
And what do you think their reason is for indoctrination? Why do you think they do not allow their students to learn, or learners, as they say nowadays, to learn various sources and various views?
Conflicting views and alternative views of history and science and so on. Yes, well, obviously the most of the people involved in education institutions are sincere people who mean well and who are not intentionally indoctrinating or disinforming people, but they're also victims of the system. They are products of the system, and so many people teach as they were taught and do as was done unto them because they don't know any better. Now, those of us who are older, like myself, next year I'll be 60, I was brought up in the old schooling system where we were instructed and we were pushed to think. So, for example, my first high school teacher in Rhodesia, he was also a member of Parliament, Mr. Rhys Davies, and he started off with, beware the victor's version. School textbooks are written by political appointees and they regurgitate wartime propaganda. Truth is the first victim of war. Governments lie. Politicians lie. Never trust the textbook. Never regurgitate the textbook. And he'd regularly get us and say, think outside the box. Don't just regurgitate the textbook. Now, that's the kind of education I got. We were encouraged to think critically, to question. So when I came down from Rhodesia to Cape Town, to Pinelands High School, and I was in a classroom, I got into trouble because I would be questioning, saying, why? But surely, sir, that can't be true because of this, that, and the other. Next thing, I was being sent off to the vice principal's office for being cheeky in class. And I never meant to be cheeky. I wasn't trying to be rude. I was asking questions in a critical way, which is the way I was taught to think in the regional schooling system.
And then why do you think that there is such a difference between the teachers of your time and the teachers of the present? That they do not allow questions and they do not allow challenges or wanting to know a different version?
Well, this is very disturbing. Why? That's a good question and it needs to be answered. And I think part of the problem is we've moved from a system where the world used to believe that truth does not fear investigation. Freedom of speech is essential for freedom. And you must have freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom of worship, freedom of association. These basic freedoms were championed for centuries as the foundation of Western Christian civilization. But somewhere in the latter half of the 20th century, it became popular and trendy to say, all right-thinking people agree. No one in their right mind could disagree. You can't think that. That's a thought crime. That's not politically correct. That's insensitive. That's intolerant. You're being judgmental. And so suddenly, whole areas of debate were being shut down, and what you were having is conformity. Now, universities used to be places of iron sharpens iron. Everything is open on the table. Everything is open for discussion because truth does not fear investigation. And debate and iron sharpening iron in the public marketplace of the school square is healthy. But somehow it got more and more. They were shutting us down. only a right-wing fundamentalist, intolerant bigot could think this. You are a mental dinosaur.
But then,
nobody can question this and that.
But then what do you think is the predominant factor as to why this has now suddenly become such a hated thing?
It's the triumph of evolutionism, secular humanism, atheism, of anti-Christian prejudice, of a paganism even in some ways. Now you may say, where have all these things come from? Well, the human heart is a bit of an idol factory, and sin is in every one of our hearts. Because we are created by God, there's good in the worst of us. Because we are fallen creation, there's evil even in the best of us. So we're fallen creation. This explains the goodness and the greatness of man. His potential comes from the fact that we're created by God. But the evil and the self-destructiveness of man comes because we're fallen and we're living in a fallen world. Now, recognizing this, the reformers saw the need for checks and balances and to be very careful, because we cannot trust human beings totally. I mustn't trust my own judgment. I must look at the full scheme of God's revelation in nature, general revelation, in the Bible, special revelation, and through church history, and also the cumulative wisdom of great giants of the faith, intellectually and spiritually through history, and learn from history and learn from the classics of history, the classic books, whether you're talking about the Jane Austens or the Charles Dickenses, the great books of history, and Pilgrim's Progress and so on. But what's happened in the last century, especially the last half century, has been a shrinking of the human mind, a shrinking of education. In fact, we might be living in one of the dumbest generations ever. And that, by the way, is not my opinion. Dr. R.C. Sproul, one of the greatest Christian apologists of the last century, has said that in my hearing. He said, we could be living in the dumbest generation in history. And he said, my proof for this, you used to have to be able to debate in Latin to enter university. Today they have remedial English in university. And there's something wrong. Why are our people getting dumber? Well, it's a failure of the education system. The education system has now been hijacked by people who have an agenda to try and reshape the world from a Christian worldview to a secular, humanist, anti-Christian worldview. And you can see it. You can see it in the entertainment industry, predominated by Hollywood, which is anti-Christ, pagan, and you can see it in the news media, and you can see it in the so-called education institutions.
And then why do you think these modern and evil mindsets have, or how do you think they have infiltrated the school systems of today and the education systems of today? That if you look back 20 to 30 years ago, such mindsets were thought to be ridiculous. And now it's a common factor.
And it's the accepted wisdom, and if you question it, there's something wrong with you.
Yes, that you will get places like UCT, Stellenbosch, Tux. These are universities that used to be very well respected and renowned
And
20
rightly
years
so.
ago.
Even, yes.
And as you get into the more modern situation, it's completely the opposite.
Yes, what used to be obviously right, for example, when I was brought up, it was considered right and just that a man has these duties, which included conscription, going into the army, being willing to sacrifice yourself for protecting your family, that the highest goal for a woman would be to be a mother and to raise the next generation, and that men should be providers and protectors. And there was a general understanding of the division of labor and of responsibilities, and that intact families were ideal for society, and as goes the family, so goes the nation, and the philosophy in the classroom in this generation will be the philosophy of government in the next generation. And you had this instilling of character. And I remember them saying many a time in school in Rhodesia, Milton High School where I went, they said, the most important thing we have to teach you here is character. That you will be a good sportsman on the field, that you'll know how to win graciously, how to lose graciously, how to be a team player, how to be able to not only work well together, but to become stronger, to become more effective, to become a person of integrity, to become a person of honesty. And so they were saying what we do on the playground, what we do in the sports field, what we do in the classroom is all about character. You need to become a person of integrity with a great work ethic and so on. And the goal is that you will head up families. Well, I went to an all-boys school, so they were focusing only on the men. And obviously the girls' schools would have had their emphasis. And so everything about us was building us up to be character. Now, you go to schools today and what have you got? well, they're teaching you, even Harry Potter can be reading assignments and set work books and, witchcraft and garbage like this. I've even come across schools in the Transvaal where a requirement for essay for English was plan a bank robbery. What type of weapons would you use? What kind of getaway cars? Like we need more bank robbers in South Africa. And the mindset has been to criminalize, paganize, and now this comprehensive sexual education thing they're trying to bring in next is straight pornography. Now, what has changed? What used to be obviously right is now considered wrong. And what used to be criminal is now considered not just normative, but it's considered admirable. And if you question it, there's something wrong with you. In fact, you're a criminal and you should be criminalized. So that the inversion of reality, for anyone who's got a memory, who's lived 50, 60 years, has got to look at this and say, wait a minute, this is ridiculous. It's like there's been a revolution. Right is now wrong, wrong is now right, up is down, and they've inverted reality. And this is deeply disturbing.
Well, now that we look at the current situation which we are in, is there any form of positivity? In what ways do schools today actually prepare students for real life? Do you think this is even a common occurrence? Well,
that's an excellent question, because I don't know that schools today are preparing students for real life. I mean, just consider what's real life. Real life is working, which includes working with your hands. Now, do they teach the average children this? If you go to Europe, for example, where we've got family in Austria, they will stream you so that already in junior school, if you're going to be a carpenter, or you're going to be a plumber or an electrician or a engineer, a taxi driver, a cook, whatever it is, they're really streaming you.
So they'd be putting you into trade schools.
Effectively, you are being prepared for your career. So if you're going to be a sportsman, if you're going to be a medical person, you're already being streamed that way. Now, in any society, you don't need that many politicians, poets, English majors, and people with political science. But today, if you go up to UCT, it seems like every second person studying gender studies and political science, and like, in what universe is that practical? So your mother, my wife, she was being taught catering skills already in school. She was being taught home economics and all those different things early on, and she's just absolutely world-class, superb in these areas. I was being taught at school, junior school already, woodwork, metalwork, marching, shooting. Even before I'd left junior school, we were on bush survival courses where game rangers were teaching us bush survival, how to survive in the bush, where to get your water from, how to survive, the kind of things you got in Scouts. But this was part of the school curriculum, part of the school day. We would learn how to track and anti-track and survive in the bush. Today, do they even teach people how to balance a budget, and how, if you want to gamble, you might as well, throw your money down the toilet, because you've got 5 times more chance of being struck by lightning than winning the lottery. And yet we've got people today who don't seem to realize that if you go out there and you hire purchase things, you're paying vast amount more for it than if you just saved up and bought the item straight. There's basic common sense economics that are not being taught in schools today that were part of the curriculum when I was growing up.
And now, living in a world today where gender roles are now being switched, changed, and people are living confused lives and such, a big complaint that the people of today would have is that you are forcing males or females, or whatever the other 72 genders there are, that you are forcing them into a certain way of life or a certain gender-specific role. Do you think that men learning some female skills and women learning some male skills, do you think that would be valuable at all?
Look, there could be some. And so, for example, I know that people are going to think that I'm giving away my background too much with this. But, for example, girls in Rhodesia were also taught how to handle firearms and how to shoot. And they also had chances to do some bush survival skills. And we were also taught how to dance. And so, very awkward, probably one of the most awkward things ever to do in school. They'd line up all of us and we'd go into the local girls' school. I mean, we were Milton, they were Evelyn. I hadn't even really spoken to a girl before in my life, and you lined up and whoever you're opposite, that's who you dance with, and they would teach us how to dance. And why must I learn to dance? It's part of culture, it's part of civilization. You've got to learn how to dance. Now, in some ways, we had to learn some things. Well, I mean, you could say everything from paramedics and onwards. It was part of our schooling. But generally speaking, there was a tremendous stability in being brought up in an all-boys school, or in the case of the others, all-girls schools, where you know your duties, you know your responsibilities, you know your fulfillment. And the fact is, it is a biological fact that men are made stronger, generally speaking, with a few exceptions, than women. And men can generally survive better in war, dig trenches, have the upper body weight to be able to lift up another man who's wounded, put him over his shoulder with his kit and run with your kit and rifle and another man's full weight. A woman can't do that. They're not built like that unless rare exceptions. And so this idea that women can go into combat, and it's just not right. Women are made to nurture life and be loving. To try and take women and make them into killers, like conscription of the army in Israel, or as the American army now wants to put women in combat. Interesting that the American presidents who never served in the army, Clinton and Obama, were the ones who put American women in combat roles. It's not right. Mothers even being put into combat roles where they're losing legs, arms, coming home crippled. It's just not right. So I am still part of that age and generation that's convinced that having gender-specific roles, knowing who you are, and we weren't confused. And also, I must say, which may seem unfair to the average young person today, because you say, well, gee, we're not having that privilege, but I never had any insecurity about being male or about having my parents love one another. We didn't know about divorce. Divorce was rare. Today, divorce is norm. It's so common that it's more exceptional to have parents still living together. So I think that the older way, the traditional way, was the safer way. And what it produced? More stable societies, happier people. Today we've got epidemic drug abuse and epidemic suicide rates. Do you know, for example, in the United States today, the US Army loses more soldiers, men and women, to suicide than to enemy action. They're fighting a lot of wars on many fronts and many wars. But the thousands of men and women they've lost in combat in the last 20 years, less than the amount have committed suicide. Now, what's wrong with our society? When I was growing up, suicide was so rare. Today, it's common amongst teenagers.
And then what are your thoughts on the modern system of having co-ed schools?
Well, because I didn't grow up in a co-ed school...
Was this even heard of in the olden days?
Well, I didn't know about a co-ed school when I was growing up. I went to all boys schools all the way through until I got to matric in Cape Town. I went to Pilots High School, and I must tell you, it was the shock of my life to suddenly have to go into school and have girls sitting around you. And it was awfully distracting because, gee, I mean, of course, attracted to girls, and they look beautiful, and everything from their hair, their eyes, everything is just like super attractive, super distracting. And I found it, of course, I wasn't used to having girls around, so I found it very distracting and difficult to go to a school that was co-ed. Now, there's no doubt that in a school that's all boys, all girls, the academics, the sports and so on is superior. They really did well. You can look at the studies. The co-ed schools don't do as well. Now, there's several reasons for it. One of the reasons is that the girls often do better in the academic system that has been organized so that the system's rigged. The average boy is not made to sit in a desk for hours on end in silence and just raise your hand and do this and then get up, move here, get in queues. And the girls somehow thrive in a lot of academic situations. The average boy doesn't. And whereas the average boy might have shone in his class, now he's looks like a dunce next to a whole lot of other girls his age, because actually the girls mature quicker too. Age-wise at school, boys catch up later, but for a long time you might feel like...
inferior.
Yes, and this is negative. It doesn't actually help. And so just in my experiences, but then reading books like Bring Up Boys, Bring Up Girls by psychologist James Dobson, I'm convinced that while co-education might work sometimes, I personally would think that all boys schools, all girls schools historically have been better. They've produced better academic results, and they produce people who are more sure of themselves. This is my duty, historic role in society, and are more fulfilled. I can say of my generation, I don't know anyone who had trouble knowing who he was. They knew who they were. And to think that some people today don't even know what gender they are, sad.
And then what does the Bible say about education?
Well, the Bible is very clear. Fathers, bring up your children in the faith. Fathers, teach your children. And so over and over in the Bible, you can see the emphasis on parents, especially the father, but both parents are responsible to bring up the children. And we are told, Deuteronomy 6, for example, to teach our children when they wake up, when they walk along the way, when they lie down, that morning, noon, and night. The Word of God is to be guiding us in education. Bring up your children in the nurture of the Lord, in the fear of the Lord, so that they will not depart from this way. So over and over in the Bible, we see the emphasis is the parents are responsible to bring up the children, and the Word of God, of course, is foundational. And the goal of education is that they might fear the Lord, that they might love the Lord, that they might serve the Lord, that they might obey His commands, that they might be blessed, that their children will be blessed, that their children's children will be blessed. And so again and again we can see the goal of education in the Bible is to bring up devout, hard-working children who will become parents, who will bring up the next generation. And so it's got a multi-generational goal. I'm not just being educated for my benefit, but for the benefit of my children, my children's children. So in the Bible, education must be biblical, character shaping, based on God's 10 commandments, and parents are responsible.
But then on that, do you think that education originates from Christianity? Or do you think education is something on its own and Christianity and biblical views are something that are merely incorporated into the school system?
We've got several books in this library right here that document that Christianity gave birth to the modern education system. By modern we mean since the 16th century. So not the very, very, very modern. So, for example, What If Jesus Had Never Been Born by James Dobson, Jerry Newcomb, and How Christianity Changed the World by Professor Alvin Smith document that it was Christianity that pioneered universal literacy, education for all classes and both genders. If you take places like the Greeks and the Romans, it was roughly only about 5% who could read and write under the previous civilizations. Christianity is the first religion and civilization that moved to 100% literacy. Before that, you didn't get much more than 5% of the population could read and write. Even in civilizations where you thought they achieved quite a lot, you might get kings and queens who couldn't read and write. But in fact, it was said to Augustine that Christian women were better educated than pagan philosophers. So the pagan philosophers were the highest educated in the pagan society, and the average Christian girl was better educated than a pagan professor or philosopher, as they said. And so Christianity is from the inception put the highest priority on education. And so education through the last 20 centuries has overwhelmingly been church-based, family-based, mission-based. Most of the schools and universities in Africa were started by missions and churches. And you may then think, well, what went wrong? Well, pagans never wanted to educate populations. If you think about it, a pagan dictator, politician, he doesn't want an educated population because they'll see what's wrong with the government and they'll see what's wrong with their policies and they won't support them. So governments have historically been hostile to education. And I would maintain they're still hostile to education, even if they've got what's called a Ministry of Education. Don't be deceived. It's not a Ministry of Education, it's a Ministry of Disinformation or Ministry of Indoctrination, because the turning point was 1848. Karl Marx, in the Marxist Manifesto, the Communist Manifesto of 1848, put down, we've got to take over education. We must have state-controlled schools. We've got to take over the schools from the churches and from the parents. We must make attendance of a state school compulsory. We must have the state monopoly on schools. We've got to have schools must be licensed by the state. Politicians must vet the textbooks. The textbooks must be produced by the state. The teachers must be trained by and licensed by the state. These were communist innovations because historically education had been a Christian domain. And to get the education of the next generation out of the hands of the Christians, state education was brought in by the communists, by Karl Marx.
So then would you say that the modern education system of today, their tactics and their way of teaching, as it were, originated from communist views and communist ways of thinking?
Yes, in fact, that's the thesis of the films Agenda and Agenda 2, made by Curtis Bauer. You know the Bauers, and they've been out here for Biblical Worldview Summits, and we've got their videos. Outstanding, about 2-hour documentary films, spectacular as they expose. The key name when it comes to secular humanist education is John Dewey. John Dewey was a signer of the Humanist Manifesto. John Dewey took Karl Marx's ideas and he said, we need to make teachers the high priests in the religion of secular humanism. We need to turn the classrooms into congregations for secular humanism. And John Dewey, after whom the Dewey Decimal System is named for how they organize libraries, John Dewey rewrote the whole state curriculum system and took the education, which education had been done by parents in homes or by churches or in church or mission schools, often in what they called the one-room classroom. Now, your mother went to a one-room classroom in Großgemein in Austria, and that's not that long ago. I mean, we're talking about 1960s, and yet the one-room classroom, they waged war on. They said, no, we have to age segregate education. And age segregating of education is also evolutionary, because before that, it wasn't thought that you've got to age segregate people. Think about this. Where in life are you age segregated? Not in work. You shouldn't be in church, although I'm sorry some churches have done that now. But this age segregation school where a 12-year-old feels, I can't speak to that 11 or 10-year-old because they're the wrong grade. And that a person 2 grades up feels, I can't talk to him because he's 1 or 2 grades lower than me. This is unrealistic. That's not the way life is. Real life is growing up with your cousins, uncles, aunts, grandparents, people of different ages and neighbors and so on. There's no age. Where's age stratification anywhere else in society aside from these unrealistic schools, which, let's face it, are failing?
So then who do you think would be the main culprits, or who do you think is most responsible for the fall of modern education today?
Names, you've got to say Karl Marx for sure, John Dewey definitely. There's others who've definitely contributed, and I'm sorry to say that you've got to say people like Schleiermacher, and there's been some thinkers who've destroyed the world. In fact, there's a book out here speaking about 7 intellectuals who wrecked the world, basically. And there's no doubt that there have been secular humanist thinkers who have messed it all up. And amongst the different names you could add would be Voltaire. Voltaire was Jean-Jacques Rousseau as well. And Voltaire were 2 of the great philosophers who led to the French Revolution. And so they were also, just take Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He's the one who pioneered the idea of the noble savage. And he reckoned the cannibal walking around naked in the Pacific Islands eating his neighbor is more noble than us civilized hypocrites living in the West going to church and so on. He said these people who wear clothes and are loyal only to one wife or husband and have raised their own children, I mean, we're the real savages. But the savages out there who have no ties of marriage, have multiple relationships, don't bother about raising their children, they're more noble than us. And somehow or another, the idea of the naked cannibal being the ideal of nobleness, and Western Christianity being savagery, evil, hypocrisy, this was something Jean-Jacques Rousseau popularized. By the way, personal detail about Jean-Jacques Rousseau: he fathered 26 children, didn't care for any of them, put them all in the poorhouse. None of them survived to adulthood. They all died in the poorhouse. That's a man who is today revered as a father of the modern education system, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau is. So we've got a whole lot of pagan philosophers. Just take a man like Karl Marx, who had, he had not only multiple affairs and illegitimate relationships, but of all of his children, 3 of his children died of starvation. 2 of his children committed suicide, and his wife committed suicide. I mean, not exactly a role model. And he never worked a day in his life, and yet Karl Marx is lifted up as the model of economics, and many universities respect this man, a man who could not even care for his own children, a man who said, I love no one, I love nothing in this world, I'm entirely satisfied with hate. Anything that's in existence deserves to be destroyed. New gods need to be installed. And so Karl Marx, who expressed very occultic, satanic kind of views, and the fruit of his life was a totally dysfunctional, wrecked family life. And yet he's the one that is being lifted up in our universities and institutes of higher learning for economics, amongst other things.
So then, as this is called From the Front Line, what do you think, or let's start at the very front of the line, the students. What can a student do who is, let's say, forced into a situation where the school is co-ed or the views are very one-sided and maybe they are being hated on or not allowed to stipulate their views? What do you think is something that they can do as a student?
It's so important to instill an attitude of resistance. I mean, in this sense, the Hunger Games films gives a good attitude of, you know, when the whole system wants to just grind you into its mold, resist, stand up. The people in Eastern Europe, they resisted. And there's so many things one can do. The first thing is read. And don't read the set-work government books. Read outside. Read the classics. Get into the great books. Read Jane Austen. Read Shakespeare. Read Charles Dickens. Read books like 1984 by George Orwell, where you learn about thought crimes and how people can become unpeople and disappear down the memory hole because they committed a thought crime, and understand how governments use newspeak and how they are using thought police in order to control thought and stifle resistance. Animal Farm, also by George Orwell. These are great books. By the way, those used to all be set-work books when I was at school, instead of the nonsense I've got today. So I would encourage, read. Readers make leaders. You've got to think. You think outside the box. And as my teacher said, beware the victor's version. Never trust the textbooks. Think, ask why. Why? There's always a reason. There's a context. You can't just come out and say, oh, this, and this. Why? What happened before? What was the context?
You want to back up your reasoning.
Yes.
You want to have more information.
You need more information. And so what I did when I was at school was I went to the public library. Back then, public libraries were good. These days, I'm afraid your public libraries wouldn't be so good because they've literally dumped out tons of great books out of the shelves into dumpsters or into the incinerator to make space for a whole lot of communist, Marxist, New World Order, New Age garbage that they've stocked our shelves with. So the average government-controlled library is not that good, but there's a lot of great materials on the internet. So we, for example, have set up William Carey BI, William Carey Bible Institute, williamcareybi.com, vast amount of free resources, and we've got audios, videos, books, PDFs, totally free from some of the best authors around the world who've donated, and you can access these things completely free online on everything from science through to journalism, news media, all the way through history and so on. So I think that's one thing. Read, think outside the box, listen. Don't just listen to the popular. The last thing you want is to let your entertainment be chosen by Hollywood and your news by the mass media. No. Go for the alternative media. Go for the community radio station. Go for the people on the ground, the people who buck the system. Just a few lovely examples from Eastern Europe. Our mission's been working 38 years helping persecute churches. I've traveled in 42 countries, 4 continents, including behind Iron Curtain, Eastern Europe. And the people of Eastern Europe, inspiring. So you take, for example, after the cosmonaut circled the Earth, he came down, he was sent on a propaganda spree by the commissars. He went to universities and schools around the Soviet Union saying, I've been into the heavens and I can report to you there is no God. And one brave girl in a school in Russia said, but comrade, the Bible says only the pure in heart can see God. And you can imagine the poor commissar and cosmonaut of that. Another commissar up in the Soviet Union spent hours berating students about this superstition of believing in God and higher power, intelligent design. And at the end said, is there anything any of you can say in response? And the whole university was seated, but one student shouted out in Russian, Christ is risen. And the entire assembly seemed to resound with him, he is risen indeed, in Russian, like the Orthodox liturgy. And this poor commissar must have felt devastated. But that's what we need. We need resistance. Like, I'm not going to just be putty, Play-Doh in the hands for your social engineering experiment. I'm going to think. And if I'm not allowed to speak out loud, I will at least make sure my mind is resisting the brainwashing.
And then moving on to the next line of defense, what do you think parents can do? And on top of that, what guidelines can parents use to restore biblical balances and sanity to either the schools or to their kids that they are sending to those schools?
Well, right. The first thing is to be informed. My people are destroyed from lack of knowledge. So it's important that we understand the issues. So, well, first of all, have you read? books like Understanding the Times by David Noble, or the short summary book The Battle for Truth, or Mind Siege. These are great books in dealing with worldviews. I've written Biblical Principles for Africa and Renaissance or Reformation. It's so important that we know the worldview. So there's some great worldview books. Straight Thinking in a Crooked World is another great book by Gary DeMar. Myths, Lies, and Deceit is another book by Gary DeMar, which is good on worldviews. We've got a Biblical Worldview Manual. Of course, you could also come to the Biblical Worldview Summit. We run a camp beginning of every year where we give a crash course on worldviews, where a person can get an understanding of what the Bible teaches on origins, economics, crime, punishment, entertainment, education.
Where can one find out information about this camp?
Right, so if you go into frontlinemissionsa.org website, frontlinemissionsa.org, you'll see under upcoming events, there's Biblical Worldview Summit. Now we've got explanation, subjects, videos, including overviews that you can see what's happened at previous ones. You can see it's body, mind, and spirit. It's everything from PT, practicals, problem solving, obstacle crossing.
Why
outreaches.
PT? Why would PT be something involved, or physical education?
Body, mind, and spirit. Again, I'm being influenced by the Christian worldview that I was brought up in, where they saw what happens on the field, what happens in a sports field, and the PT is an integral part of education. Education cannot just be we're not minds. We're mind, body, and spirit. We need to have all education needs to be fully integrated into body, mind, and spirit. And so the idea that you can just sit there and absorb knowledge without testing it in a laboratory of life and testing it on a field. If it doesn't work, don't export it and don't teach it. But so this is why I think it's so important that we don't just talk about these things. So we don't just have lectures. We have discussion groups, we have debates, we have practicals, we have debate scenarios like Just a Minute, where you've got to be able to speak in a critical environment where others are going to interrupt you, like you're on a radio debate show. And you've got a whole range of different things from Bible drill onwards. It's a design program where in 1 week you couldn't possibly learn more quicker in a more meaningful and fun way. We've been devising the Biblical Worldview Summit for years, since 1991 actually.
And all of these things are going to be happening on the camp?
Oh yes, all of it. That's correct. So obviously, first prize, best thing is come to something like the Biblical Worldview Summit near Cape Town, lovely environment, up near Hermanus, near the coast and all this. And then the Biblical Worldview Summit, attending that obviously is really good, absolutely essential first step to helping to also it's encouraging. See, I'm not the only one who thinks differently. You know, you're not insane. No, there's a lot of other people all over the world, and speakers come from around the world. We've got some top class international speakers too, and so being able to get to a summit like that's key. Now, if for some reason you can't get there, next best thing is get the books, get the audio cassettes, access the videos online, the audios. We've got box sets of videos, audios, and that's good and helpful, but bear in mind, that cannot possibly communicate the debate, the discussion groups, the prayer, the planning, the PT, the outreaches, and everything else that's involved in a Biblical Worldview Summit. But at least some of the information which can help. But then we've got to get in a network, whether it's a home education network, a discussion group, Bible study group. We've got to find like-minded people nearby as a support base. Now, in our family, our resistance to the New World Order brainwashing nonsense was to go for home education. And it's not something we went into in a hurry, but so we've tried government schools. We've tried, with our oldest, we've tried Christian schools, and we've done mostly home education. And there's no doubt in my mind that home education is the best option of all of them. And if you are having to go for whatever reason with a government schooling, the least you can do is be involved in a Parents-Teachers Association, check out the textbooks, meet the teachers, get involved in a school governing board. You will be horrified at what you discover. And you'll also discover the Parents-Teachers Association is not there to deal with the textbooks, the curriculum, and the teachers, but to deal with fundraisers. And
yes, this is something I can definitely back up. I was raised in homeschooling up until about age 11. After that, which I was put into a quote-unquote private Christian school. Independent Christian school. I was there from 2011 until 2017. I learned a lot of very valuable lessons. The whole idea of team sports, I learned a decent amount of discipline, but the education, which was apparently the most important part there, was indoctrination. In history, we would not be allowed to ask, we would not be allowed to review a different source. I remember in my grade 10 exam, we had 10 sources to answer, and 6 of those sources all had the same view. And it was something that I found insane. And when I got to my grade 11 year, I finished it, I left. Everyone at the school said that I dropped out and that I'll be helping them at McDonald's or at a fast food place. In the same year that I homeschooled my matric, I was able to work, I was able to travel overseas, I was able to do so many things in life and learn so many. I learned taxes. While in the same year, those matric students in South Africa at that school, they would be doing exams, they would be doing mock exams, they would be doing final exams. Where were they studying for majority of those exams? At home. And yet they were telling me that I was wasting my time. Meanwhile, in the same year, all they are doing is learning at a school. While I was outside, I was working, I was earning, I was traveling while getting an education.
And you've managed to get to Egypt and represent the country in biathlon.
Yes.
So, swimming in the Nile, that's got to be fun.
And just going back to your previous comments where you were speaking, and it's interesting, this is a proverb which a lot of schools use, and a proverb it's a biblical thing from the Bible. But this proverb, it says, surround yourself with like-minded people and you will flourish. So I think this is something that will be very applicable for those who are wanting to come in this BWS. You will be able to surround yourself not only with like-minded people, but also of a similar age. And this could be more applicable for your life. You know, it's all well and fair to have someone who's similar mindset of you, but they're 30 and you're still 15. Two very different lifestyles. So finding people that are of a similar age group to you, this will definitely be helpful in growing your Christian community, growing your faith as you go through the rest of your year.
Yes, so I mean, that's the thing. The home education industry worldwide is flourishing. It's flourishing in South Africa, America, all over the world. In fact, literally all over the world, you've got home education flourishing. And why? Failure of state education. Now, when the state-run schools were sticking to a biblical worldview and were saying so on, there wasn't as much of a demand and pressure for home education. But just take South Africa. We've got something like 5,000 independent schools right now, which is staggering. There didn't used to be that many independent schools, but it's a vote of no confidence in the government schools that so many private Christian schools have developed. The sad thing is, while the intentions are doubtless good, in many cases they've been bullied into taking the government curriculum, which means you might have good teachers and good intentions, but you've still got the government textbooks, which has got evolutionism, situation ethics, LGBTQ agenda, and all the other things. So it's not healthy.
And it's something that I found very interesting in multiple schools that I've either worked at or coached at or been at for different sporting events is, while these schools may be government or very secular, the majority of their principles, values, and ways of doing things are biblical. And while it's something that no school would be able to deny, that Christianity and biblical views and conservative views, which are also biblical, are the focal point of any school, any system. When you think about respect, uniforms, class times, all of these things originate from Christianity. And if you were to throw all of it out, the entire school system would crash. So when you look at secular schools,
in many places.
So if you look at your friends who are at secular schools of today, you can very easily remind them that majority of their school system originates from Christianity. So while they may think that they are atheist or agnostic, they are living a life that is Christian.
Well, just consider this. Every time an atheist writes a date, he's got to acknowledge the centrality of Christ, because 2019 what? 2019 AD, in the year of our Lord. Basically, the birth of Jesus has been the hinge on which all of history has been divided into BC, before Christ, and AD. When you go to a hospital, what's the symbol of a hospital? A red cross. Not a crescent moon, not a star, not a hammer and sickle. Why a cross? What could the possible... Well, maybe it's got something to do with Jesus and go and heal the sick, preach the gospel, do unto others you want to be done unto. Good Samaritan, go and do likewise. And so Christianity founded charity, love for neighbor, care for strangers, and there's so much more that we learn in a biblical worldview summit about everything from why do we say goodbye? It's etymology of the word is God be with you. It's an old prayer. Why do we have holidays? It comes from holy days, and so on.
As we end this, I'm sure the listeners would also want to know, where can we get resources available to learn of
Right,
these
so
things?
www.frontlinemissionsa.org. Frontlinemissionsa.org, that's the website. You can email us, mission@frontline.org.za. You can also find us on Facebook, Frontline Fellowship. You will find on Facebook not just Frontline Fellowship, but there's even a Biblical Worldview Summit Facebook page. So you can type in Biblical Worldview Summit, you'll find us too, and Frontline Fellowship on Facebook. And if you get to the frontlinemissionsa.org website, you'll find some videos of some of our Biblical Worldview Summits, some of the lectures given at Biblical Worldview Summits, and some of these issues on education. And all of the textbooks and so on that we're recommending are all available through christianlibertybooks.co.za. Christian Liberty Books, it's also got a Facebook page, but christianlibertybooks.co.za is a book ministry, wholesale and retail, based on our mission base in Cape Town, South Africa as well. And we ship internationally, and 85% of the 6,000 titles are home education related. So if someone's interested in home education, start off looking right there.
Dr. Hammond, thank you so much for your time, and thank you to all of you who tuned in. Thank you, God bless, and good night.